Ever thought about, like, actually owning a part of yourself? It's kind of a weird thought, right?
Yeah.
But it's a question that's been a real head-scratcher for, like, lawyers and stuff for centuries.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's what we're diving into today.
Okay.
This whole strange history of how the law looks at people and their bodies, not always seeing them as, something special or sacred, but sometimes you get this as straight-up property.
Wow.
So buckle up, because we're taking a trip through time to explore some seriously thought-provoking cases.
I'm ready.
From, like the really heavy stuff like slavery.
Right.
To modern-day dilemmas like surrogacy and frozen embryos and all the legal and ethical tangles they bring with them.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to unpack all that.
Totally. And to really kick things off, we're traveling back to a pretty intense period in American history. Pre-Civil War America.
Oh, wow.
Tensions over slavery were crazy high back then.
Yeah, definitely a powder keg.
And right in the thick of it all, you've got this guy, Dred Scott.
Right.
And he makes a really bold move.
What's that?
He decides to sue for his freedom.
Wow.
And that's where our first case takes us.
So what makes the Dred Scott case so important is that it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
The highest court in the land.
Exactly. And this was at a time when the nation was like this close to completely falling apart.
Talk about high stakes.
No kidding.
So for our listener who might not know the ins and outs of this case, can you set the scene for us? Dred Scott, he'd been living in free states and territories.
Right.
You'd think that would automatically make him free, right?
You would think so, yeah.
So what on earth happened when his case went to court?
Well, the Supreme Court, with Chief Justice Roger Taney leading the charge, they made a decision that really shook the nation.
And spoiler alert, it wasn't in Dred Scott's favor.
Sadly, no, it wasn't.
This wasn't just like a regular legal loss. This was a decision that had huge implications.
Huge is an understatement.
For how black people were viewed and treated under the law.
Exactly. This decision basically set a dangerous precedent.
So tell us, what was the court's rationale? What was their justification for this ruling?
Well, Taney's reasoning was really unsettling. He actually had the audacity to claim that when the Founding Fathers wrote about all men being created equal in the Declaration of Independence.
You know those famous words?
Yeah, those very words. He claimed they couldn't possibly have meant all men.
It's mind-blowing, isn't it?
Totally.
Like they were being so radical with that statement.
Right. In Taney's view, those grand words only applied to white men.
So the idea of black people free or enslaved being considered citizens, having the same rights as everyone else under the Constitution.
Unthinkable, according to Taney.
Wow. So basically this decision declared that black people were not citizens, period.
Yeah, regardless of whether they were free or enslaved.
That's heavy stuff.
It really is.
And to think this wasn't just some abstract legal theory, this was about real people's lives.
Exactly, their freedom, their very humanity being debated in a courtroom.
It's a chilling reminder of how deeply rooted these beliefs were in the legal system back then.
It's a dark chapter in American legal history, for sure.
Absolutely. And it really sets the stage for the rest of our conversation today.
It does make you wonder how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
Right, and that's what we're going to be exploring further today.
It's going to be a fascinating deep dive.
It definitely will be.
Yeah.
You know, when we look back at a case like Dred Scott, it's a stark reminder of how the law has been used to, dehumanize and oppress entire groups of people.
It's true, and it's something that still echoes in our legal system even today.
Absolutely, and it underscores this ongoing struggle to define personhood ownership control.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about human body.
Absolutely.
And, fast forward to the 20th century.
Oh, okay.
With all these advances in reproductive technology.
Right.
And suddenly we're facing a whole new set of legal and ethical puzzles.
Oh, for sure.
And I think a really powerful illustration of this is the Baby M case.
Oh, yeah, that one was a big deal.
The surrogacy arrangement that went so wrong.
It really threw a wrench into everything we thought we knew about family law.
Totally. So for our listener who might not be familiar with this case, can you give us like a quick rundown?
Sure thing. So we're in the 1980s in New Jersey, and we've got this couple, the Stearns, who can't have biological children of their own.
Heartbreaking situation.
It really is. And that's where Mary Beth Whitehead comes in.
She agrees to be their surrogate.
Exactly. And at first glance, it seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, you've got a couple desperate for a child and a woman willing to help them make that dream a reality.
Right. And they draw up a contract to make it all official.
But as we've seen time and time again, contracts can get messy.
Oh, yeah. And in this case, things went very, very wrong.
So Mary Beth Whitehead, She gives birth to a baby girl. And then she experiences this wave of, what can only be described as a mother's love.
Right.
And she realizes she just can't bring herself to give up this child.
Oh, wow. So it was more than just a change of heart.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a simple case of buyer's remorse or anything like that.
Right.
This was about the very essence of motherhood, this unbreakable bond between a mother and her child.
And suddenly the courts are stuck trying to figure out how to untangle this incredibly complex and sensitive situation.
Talk about a legal and ethical minefield.
You've got that right.
I mean, this case was everywhere in the news. People were debating it at their dinner tables. It was inescapable.
It really captured the nation's attention.
Because at its core, it forced us to grapple with this question. Can you really put a price on parenthood?
It's a tough question.
Should a contract be able to overpower a mother's love for her child?
I mean, those are some heavy implications.
No kidding.
So what did the courts decide?
Well, the New Jersey Supreme Court, they made a landmark ruling.
Okay.
They said that surrogacy contract, it was invalid.
They threw it out.
They did. They argued that it went against New Jersey state laws against baby selling.
Which makes sense.
And most importantly, they said it wasn't in the best interest of the child.
Wow. So they really prioritized the child's well-being above all else.
They did. And this decision had massive ripple effects.
I bet it did.
It changed the way people thought about surrogacy and how these arrangements are regulated.
Not just in New Jersey, right?
Yeah.
But across the country.
Exactly. It really forced lawmakers to step up and establish clearer guidelines for surrogacy.
It's like they had to play catch-up with this whole new frontier of reproductive technology.
Exactly. And it sparked this broader conversation about everyone's rights.
Okay.
Not just the intended parents, but also the surrogate, and of course, most importantly, the child.
That's so important to remember that there are so many stakeholders involved in these situations.
Absolutely. And speaking of complex situations,
Yeah.
if navigating the legalities of one child is complicated,
Right.
just imagine dealing with the fate of dozens of potential lives.
You're talking about frozen embryos. It's like something out of a science fiction novel.
It really is. So let's say you and your partner, you create these frozen embryos,
Okay.
and then down the line you split up.
Happens all the time, unfortunately.
It does. So then the question becomes, who gets to decide what happens to those embryos?
Right, because it's not always clear-cut, is it?
Not at all. It's not like splitting up your record collection.
No kidding.
These are potential human lives we're talking about.
Right, and that raises all sorts of questions.
Exactly.
Wow.
Like, do those embryos have rights? Are they considered people property or something else entirely?
It's a real head-scratcher, and the courts are still trying to wrap their heads around it.
So it's like the Wild West out there in the world of reproductive law.
Pretty much. The courts are trying to shoehorn these centuries-old legal concepts
I know, right?
into this brave new world of biotechnology.
It's like fitting a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly, and it leads to some really interesting legal battles.
So how are the courts even approaching these frozen embryo disputes?
Well, there have been a couple of landmark cases that give us some insight.
Oh, really?
Like what?
Yeah.
So there's the case of Davis v. Davis.
Okay.
And in that case, the court ultimately sided with the party who did not want the embryos used,
Interesting.
emphasizing this right to not procreate.
Which makes sense when you think about it.
It does.
Having a child is a huge decision,
Huge.
and no one should be forced into it if they've had a change of heart.
Couldn't agree more.
Then you've got the case of Kass v. Kass.
Okay.
And this one's interesting because the court took a slightly different approach.
How so?
They focused more on the initial agreement that the couple had made.
Interesting.
But here's the kicker. They reached the same conclusion.
the embryos weren't used.
Exactly. So you have these two different legal arguments,
Right.
but the same outcome.
So it seems like the right to not procreate tends to carry a lot of weight in these cases.
Mm-hmm. It does. And, it raises a whole other ethical dilemma.
What's that?
What about the rights of the embryo itself?
Oh, wow.
We're talking about a whole other level of complexity.
Uncharted territory, really, both legally and ethically.
Okay, so we've gone from the deeply troubling legacy of slavery to the complex world of surrogacy and frozen embryos.
And believe it or not, it's about to get even wilder.
Oh, really?
Yeah, our next case throws us headfirst into the rabbit hole of body ownership.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on us.
This one involves a guy named John Moore
Okay.
and his cells. They ended up being worth a fortune.
Wait, what? How does that even happen?
It's like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, honestly.
So tell me more. What's the story with John Moore and his super valuable cells?
So picture this John Moore, totally ordinary guy,
Okay.
just trying to fight off leukemia.
awful disease.
The worst. And as part of his treatment, he has to get a splenectomy.
Yeah, okay. Pretty standard procedure, right?
I think so, right?
Yeah.
But in Moore's case, his spleen, it held something pretty extraordinary.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What was it?
His cells, they had this crazy ability to produce these really valuable proteins.
Proteins. Like, what kind of proteins are we talking about?
Proteins that could actually fight cancer and other diseases.
Whoa, so we're talking like a potential gold mine for medical research.
Exactly, big time.
So what did they do? Did John Moore get to be a part of this whole scientific discovery thing?
Well, not quite how you might imagine.
Oh, no.
Here's the kicker. His doctors, they took those unique cells and they developed something called a cell line.
A cell line.
Yeah, basically a scientific tool with huge value. And get this, they did it all without ever getting Moore's consent or even telling him what they were up to.
Hold up, they used his cells without his permission. That's a huge ethical violation, isn't
Well,
it?
you're telling me in medicine there's this fundamental principle called informed consent.
Right.
Basically means doctors have to tell their patients about everything, the risks, the benefits, you name it, before they do anything. And they definitely need to get their permission, especially when it comes to using someone's cells for research.
Absolutely.
And in this case, well-informed consent wasn't exactly a priority.
Wow. So they took his cells without asking, used them to develop this potentially lucrative cell line.
And that's where things get really complicated because the cell line derived from Moore cells had the potential to be insanely profitable.
Oh, man. I bet Moore was not happy when he found out about all this.
You think? He was furious, and rightfully so.
I can only imagine.
So what does he do? He decides to sue, claiming he had property rights to his own cells.
I mean, that makes sense, right?
Right. And he argued that he deserved a cut of the profits.
That seems fair.
This case, it snowballed into a huge legal battle and eventually landed in the lap of the California Supreme Court.
No way, the highest court in California.
The one and only. So everyone's watching, waiting to see how this will all shake out. Will the court recognize his right to his own cells?
Right. I mean, how could they deny him a share of the profits when it all started with his body?
Yeah, it seemed like a pretty open and shut case to a lot of people.
So what happened? Did he win?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. While the court agreed that Moore's doctors had acted unethically by not getting his informed consent,
Okay.
their decision on the property rights issue wasn't what most people were expecting.
Wait, so they sided with the researchers? How could they do that?
Yeah, it seemed kind of backwards, but the court, they had their reasons. They were worried about the implications of saying that patients have property rights to their cells.
Okay, I can see how that could get complicated.
Yeah.
What were their concerns?
Well, they were afraid that it would basically bring medical research to a screeching halt.
How so?
They argued that if patients could profit from their cells every time a scientist made a discovery, it would lead to a tidal wave of lawsuits.
Yeah, that could definitely get messy.
Total chaos. It would be a nightmare to track down every single person whose cells played a part in a discovery, and the threat of endless lawsuits could scare scientists away from pursuing groundbreaking research.
So they were essentially prioritizing the greater good.
Exactly. They believed that the potential benefits for society outweighed the rights of the individual in this case.
So basically they were saying it's better to potentially save countless lives through medical advancements, even if it means some individuals might not have complete control over how their cells are used.
That was their stance. It's a tough one to grapple with, for sure.
It is. There's no easy answer in the situation. On one hand, you have the possibility of life-saving treatments and therapies.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have someone being denied control over their own body and any profits that might come from it.
It's such a gray area, both legally and ethically.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, this whole issue isn't limited to just cells and tissues.
Oh, absolutely.
We're seeing these same dilemmas pop up with things like genetic information organ donation, even the data collected from our digital footprints.
Right. Our Fitbit data, our online searches, it's all fair game.
It's wild when you think about it.
It really is. I think what we're seeing is that our legal and ethical frameworks, they're playing catch up.
Totally. They're struggling to keep pace with how fast biotechnology is advancing.
Yeah, we're in uncharted territory, and there are no easy answers.
No easy answers indeed. Well, that about wraps it up for this deep dive into the strange history of owning people and their parts.
It's been quite a journey.
It has, from those early days of treating human beings as property to today's mind-boggling questions about cells and embryos and everything in between.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And one thing is clear. This conversation is far from over.
Not by a long shot. As technology continues to evolve, the lines will only get blurrier.
That's for sure.
Huh.
And it's up to all of us to grapple with these complex issues head on.
Absolutely. We need to think critically about what it means to be human in a world where the very essence of our being can be manipulated and commodified.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh.
So to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming. Keep those conversations going because the future of humanity might just depend on it.
I completely agree.